The most unsettling forest patrol cases ever reported. Kellen Brook worked forest patrol along a stretch of old timberland where archived reports claimed strange incidents often occurred. He knew the area carried a reputation tied to scattered claims from hikers who described sudden silences that felt unnatural. He never bought into local rumors since most incidents ended with simple explanations supported by clear evidence. That changed during a series of nights when several unrelated calls pointed toward one narrow valley near a forgotten service road. Kellen started his shift in early autumn while thin fog drifted between fading pines that made the ridgeline look fractured. He planned a standard sweep meant to confirm trail markers after heavy storms had washed out parts of the northern route. He carried a basic radio, a dated camera, and a small notebook used for quick sketches whenever terrain needed documentation. Nothing about that evening suggested trouble since the air felt cold but steady, with no wind moving through the soft canopy overhead. The first sign came from an archived emergency call taped around 20 years earlier, which dispatch asked him to review. The caller had whispered about lights drifting between trees near a narrow ravine before the line abruptly cut without any follow-up. Records showed a short search took place but ended early since heavy weather overwhelmed the valley that same night. Kellen noted the coordinates because the location sat close to his planned route for trail checks. He treated it like a curiosity rather than something dangerous, since old calls often lacked reliable context. As he moved deeper into the valley, he found a patch of ground flattened in a shape that looked deliberate rather than natural. The soil showed long, dragging marks that stopped near a cluster of split branches pointing toward a dry creek bed. He photographed each detail so dispatch could review them with clearer reference than vague descriptions alone. A faint smell of burned resin drifted through the air, which he tried to trace without finding any clear source. He wrote a line in his notebook, noting the scent because it matched earlier reports from two hikers who claimed the same detail only days apart. Kellen followed the dragging marks until they disappeared under a fallen trunk coated with dark moss that looked recently disturbed. As he circled the trunk, he found part of a torn fabric strip caught under exposed roots. He radioed dispatch and explained the discovery while keeping his voice steady so no emotion colored the report. Dispatch confirmed a missing person alert filed 3 weeks earlier involving a traveler who passed through a nearby trailhead. No signs connected the two cases, yet the fabric color matched the backpack described in the original notes. He continued toward the ridge where fir trees grew in a tight pattern that blocked moonlight enough to make shadows look solid. Sounds felt muted, as if the valley swallowed movement before it could echo across the slope. Kellen paused because he sensed pressure in the air, similar to a storm front closing in without visible clouds. He lifted his camera and snapped several shots across the tree line, hoping later review would reveal details unseen by his eyes. The images appeared ordinary on the small screen, though one showed a faint streak of light that did not match his lamp. He climbed toward an old maintenance shed built sometime around 1980, according to retired staff who once worked the region. The structure leaned forward as if pulled down slope after decades of soft ground slowly shifting under heavy snow. When Kellen pushed the door, it creaked loud enough to send echoes across the valley floor. Inside, he found a row of metal hooks used for gear storage, though only one held something unusual, which looked like a taped bundle wrapped tight. He opened the bundle and found several developed photos showing night scenes from the same valley taken from odd angles. The photos showed distant silhouettes standing near trees that grew in impossible straight lines, suggesting the shots captured something staged. One silhouette appeared blurred in a way that suggested motion not captured cleanly by the camera shutter. Another photo showed a close shot of the ravine with 3 bright streaks drifting above the ground. Kellen studied each image carefully and noticed faint symbols scratched into the corners that looked like markers or directional notes. He pocketed the bundle so evidence remained protected for later examination under controlled lighting. As he left the shed, a heavy crack echoed from the southern ridge, which caused him to grip his radio tighter. He reported the sound to dispatch and asked whether seismic sensors recorded any movement in the region. Dispatch stated the grid showed no activity and advised caution since earlier storms weakened several slopes. Kellen moved slowly toward the ridge where the sound originated and followed scattered prints that looked human despite the uneven spacing. The prints continued until they reached a shallow ledge overlooking the valley where wind suddenly picked up. From the ledge, he spotted a flashlight lying near a cluster of rocks arranged in a wide arc. The light still worked, which suggested it had not been exposed to heavy weather for long. He lifted it and saw faint letters carved into the metal case that looked rushed. The letters formed a partial message reading, "Please leave now," which caused him to feel sudden tension in his shoulders. He checked surrounding ground for more prints and noticed a second set leading from the rocks toward a narrow descent hidden by brush. Kellen followed the descent until he reached a flat clearing that rarely appeared on official maps due to outdated surveys. The ground felt colder than other parts of the valley, as if air currents remained trapped there. He saw several wooden markers placed at irregular intervals across the clearing that resembled crude directional signs. Each marker pointed toward the tree line, where the soil darkened from repeated disturbance over many years. He documented each marker with his camera and noted their alignment, since they created a pattern matching the scratch symbols from the shed photos. A sudden metallic sound rang through the clearing like a dropped tool hitting stone, though no source appeared. Kellen crouched and switched off his lamp, hoping his eyes would adjust enough to spot movement. In the dim light, he saw a faint shape moving between trees in a slow rhythm that suggested someone scanning the area. He called out, asking whether anyone needed help, since missing persons sometimes tried to approach officers only after hearing clear identification. The shape paused but did not respond, which made him suspect fear rather than aggression. He stepped forward and repeated his call while keeping his hand near his radio in case he needed backup. The shape moved again and revealed the outline of a man who looked thin enough to suggest long exposure to harsh conditions. When the man stepped closer, Kellen recognized him from the missing persons alert filed 3 weeks earlier. The man whispered that he never meant to come this far, but something kept drawing him back toward the valley. Kellen asked what he meant, though. The man only pointed toward the tree line where shadows shifted. The man said he followed lights that moved like lanterns drifting without handlers, and he believed someone used them to guide travelers. He claimed he found others who appeared confused and kept walking in circles around the clearing. Kellen tried to gather accurate details, but the man struggled to recall exact sequences due to exhaustion. Kellen guided him towards safer ground while radioing for medical support before returning attention to the clearing. He wanted to understand why the markers aligned with symbols found in older reports. When he re-entered the clearing, he noticed faint impressions in the soil that looked like repeated tracking routes used by unknown individuals. He photographed the impressions and followed them until he reached a rise overlooking the ravine where earlier calls reported drifting lights. The rise contained a cluster of stones shaped in a wide triangle pointing north. He believed earlier officers missed the shape due to overgrowth that only recently cleared following storms. He took more photos and marked the coordinates for a later grid search. As he stepped back from the stones, a beam of light drifted across the ravine, although no visible carrier held it. The movement resembled a search pattern rather than a random bounce of reflection. Kellen raised his camera, but the light vanished before he could capture it. He wrote in his notebook that the disappearance felt deliberate because it faded at the exact moment he pointed the lens. He searched for reflective surfaces that could cause such an effect, but found none within the immediate area. Kellen returned to the clearing once the sky shifted toward early dawn because he suspected low light angles might reveal details. Morning haze illuminated the markers enough to expose more scratched symbols hidden on the lower edges. The symbols matched coordinates found in archived cases spanning nearly 30 years. He realized the pattern suggested multiple individuals returned to the same clearing across different decades. The consistency implied a location used for repeated gatherings, although no record confirmed any organized activity. When backup units arrived, they assisted with mapping the valley and collecting soil samples around the triangular stones. Reports written later suggested the area might amplify natural light distortions caused by mineral deposits under the ravine. The theory explained drifting beams, though it did not explain earlier sightings of silhouettes or the aligned symbols. Kellen submitted all photos and notes so analysts could compare them with older cases for shared markers. The missing man received treatment and later confirmed the valley held a strange pull that disrupted his sense of direction. Investigators concluded the valley created conditions that isolated travelers through unusual acoustics and light behavior. The shifting shadows caused depth confusion, which made certain silhouettes appear larger and more distant. Kellen accepted the explanation, though he remained unsettled by the carved message found on the flashlight. The message suggested someone understood the valley better than recorded reports implied. That person left a warning aimed at whoever discovered the rocks arranged in deliberate patterns. Kellen ended the case with a belief that the valley held no supernatural threat, though it definitely influenced those who entered. He felt confident most incidents stemmed from natural forces mixing with human fear in remote terrain. Still, he kept a copy of the scratch symbols in his notebook to remind himself that patterns rarely appear by accident. The valley stayed quiet for months after the investigation, though rangers continued periodic checks in case new prints appeared. Every time Kellen passed the turnout leading toward the valley, he felt a subtle pressure in the air that never fully faded. What happened inside that Nevada roadside diner will shock you. The archived highway incident logs tied to that Nevada diner always mentioned strange gaps in witness accounts that never fully aligned. The building sat miles from the nearest town, and many travelers swore the place felt heavier than any normal roadside stop should. Those details rarely mattered until one night when a patrol officer named Rylan Yates stepped inside during what should have been a routine welfare check. Rylan was 39 and worked traffic patrol across long desert routes where calls often involved stalled trucks or wandering livestock. His shift began quiet, and he planned to finish early reports before sunrise since a regional audit required updated vehicle logs. He drove toward the diner because dispatch received a brief call from an unknown traveler who claimed something felt wrong inside the building. The line cut before any clarification reached operators. Wind pushed sand across the empty highway as Rylan parked near the dark windows that reflected faint moonlight across cracked paint. He knocked on the glass, hoping someone inside would respond since the call sounded distressed. No sound followed except a soft rattling that seemed to echo from deeper inside the structure. He called out again while pushing the door that opened easily, as if someone forgot to lock it. A cold draft hit him, although the night outside felt warm. Inside, he saw booths lined along both walls and a counter coated with dust despite clear signs of recent movement. He noticed a mug placed awkwardly near the register with steam still rising from inside. Steam suggested someone left moments earlier, which raised concern because no staff or customers appeared anywhere. Rylan clicked his small recorder and began documenting details since protocol required evidence for unexplained vacancies. His voice stayed neutral while describing the mug and the untouched plate beside it. He moved toward the back hallway where kitchen doors pushed inward due to bent hinges that looked recently forced. A faint ringing sound drifted from deeper in the building like a timer repeating in slow cycles. Rylan checked each booth for belongings and found a folded jacket wedged under a seat cushion. The jacket pocket held a bus pass issued to a traveler named Darren Keats, who boarded in Bakersfield 2 days earlier. No missing persons alert listed that name, so Rylan kept the pass for later verification. The ringing grew louder as he approached the kitchen, which smelled of scorched metal rather than food. He stepped inside and found a griddle still warm with burned residue forming a dark crust. A spatula lay on the floor, bent in the middle as if struck by something heavy. The order tickets near the prep station hung crooked, with several torn in half without explanation. He raised his flashlight and noticed faint drag marks across the tile leading toward a walk-in freezer door that remained slightly ajar. Rylan called out, asking whether anyone was stuck or injured because drag marks often pointed toward medical emergencies. His radio crackled with static that drowned dispatch responses, which suggested interference inside the building. He pushed the freezer door open and saw frost coating the inner walls, while a single boot print froze into the floor. The print looked recent due to sharp edges around the outline. No person waited inside, which made the freezer feel colder than normal. He stepped back into the hallway and noticed another door partially open at the far end, which led to a storage room rarely seen by customers. The air inside felt warmer than the rest of the building, which confused him because storage rooms usually ran cooler. Shelves lined the walls, though several boxes toppled in patterns that looked deliberate rather than random. He found a small camcorder lying near a crate with its battery still warm. The last clip played automatically, showing shaky footage recorded inside the diner earlier that evening. The footage showed a man filming himself as he sat in a booth, complaining about flickering lights above him. He turned the camera toward the counter while saying he heard something metallic hitting the floor in the kitchen, though no staff answered his calls. The camera jerked suddenly as the man reacted to a loud bang behind him. He stood quickly, and the footage ended with the image tilting toward the ceiling before cutting to black. Ryland saved the clip to the evidence log for later analysis. He left the storage room and followed the metallic bang direction toward a narrow service hallway behind the counter. The hallway contained several old signs stacked against walls and a broken jukebox leaning sideways with wires exposed. The air smelled of ozone, which usually indicated electrical issues. He checked the fuse box at the far end and found every switch in the down position despite the lights inside the diner earlier appearing functional. He photographed the box and wrote a quick note stating power flowed from an unknown source. As he turned around, he noticed a narrow crawlspace hatch slightly open under the utility sink. The hinges held dust except for a clean line where fingers looked to have pulled it recently. Ryland knelt and lifted the hatch, revealing a ladder dropping into a small maintenance pit. He called dispatch again, though static returned immediately. He debated waiting for backup, but protocol required immediate inspection if a caller might be trapped below. He dropped his flashlight and climbed down carefully. The pit contained narrow corridors used decades earlier during renovations, according to old county maps. He walked slowly while scanning walls that showed scratches forming repeated patterns spaced evenly along the concrete. The scratches looked recent and pointed downward as if someone tried to mark a direction. He followed them until the corridor opened into a wider chamber filled with unfinished plumbing and scattered tools. In the center, he saw a collapsed chair tied with a length of cord that snapped at one end. Next to the chair lay a second camcorder along with a torn notebook page containing shaky handwriting. The page read, "Light keeps moving under the floor." Something scraped again from the kitchen. Not alone. The rest of the text ended abruptly. Ryland felt a wave of pressure in the air as if the chamber held trapped warmth from earlier activity. He recorded a new entry describing the chair, the cord, and the strange note. Every detail pointed toward panic rather than calm observation. A distant clatter echoed through the tunnels and carried toward him with an unnatural sharpness caused by concrete acoustics. He raised his flashlight and scanned the chamber until he found another tunnel leading upward at a steep angle. He followed it until he reached a metal grate blocking an exit into the rear parking lot. Through the grate, he saw sand shifting despite no wind outside, which suggested an animal or person passed moments earlier. He returned to the chamber and checked for other exits, but found none. He climbed back toward the diner interior and reached the crawlspace hatch, which now stood fully open, as if someone moved it after he entered the pit. He scanned the hallway for movement and caught a faint reflection near the jukebox. When he approached, he found a small handheld mirror placed face up on the floor. The mirror showed streaks on its surface that looked like pressure smudges from a hand that dragged downward. He collected the mirror as evidence and checked its placement for any pattern. The mirror side intake loss was boxes on the extes that this placement. Ryland moved back into the main dining area where the mug still released faint steam, although more time passed than physics allowed. He tapped the mug and felt the ceramic warm enough to suggest recent activity. A soft whisper echoed from the far booth, though no person appeared. He stepped carefully and called out again, hoping for a response. The whisper repeated with clearer tone, saying, "Stop walking," before falling silent. He checked under the booth seats, but found only dust and a single torn napkin. His radio crackled once before. Dispatch finally broke through with partial clarity. They reported receiving a second anonymous call claiming someone inside the diner dragged themselves through the back door earlier. The caller gave no further details before disconnecting. Ryland pushed through the rear exit and found fresh prints leading toward the highway turnout. The prints staggered in irregular distances, which suggested injury or disorientation. He followed them until they reached a culvert, where sand shifted into a shallow depression. Inside the depression, he found the backpack belonging to the traveler whose bus pass he found earlier. The pack held a map with a route drawn toward the diner with a note reading, "Safe place if lights stop." The message puzzled Rylan, since no earlier logs mentioned anything about lights stopping at that location. He radioed dispatch again and requested medical response while searching the immediate area for signs of the missing traveler. No signs appeared beyond the depression and a single glove lying nearby. Rylan returned to the diner once sunrise approached and found the interior cooled significantly, with the mug finally losing steam. He set all collected items on the counter to photograph them under daylight conditions. The scratches on the mirror aligned with marks found inside the tunnels, which indicated a common source. Analysts later theorized the tunnels amplified distant sounds, which caused travelers to misinterpret normal noises as threats. They believed the claustrophobic environment and flickering old wiring created panic episodes. Still, Rylan remained unsure because the camcorder footage showed the man reacting to something clearly auditory before the cut occurred. The torn notebook page suggested sustained fear rather than brief confusion. Investigators searched the surrounding desert and found no trace of the traveler except the glove and backpack. The bent spatula and dragged chair created further confusion as none matched signs of electrical malfunction. They concluded the traveler likely became disoriented and fled into the desert before collapsing from exhaustion. The diner closed for several months following the investigation due to safety concerns tied to unstable flooring above the tunnels. County officials sealed the pit, though. Rylan visited the site twice during follow-up inspections. Each visit left him unsettled due to a persistent faint ringing he heard near the kitchen, despite power remaining shut off. Engineers explained the ringing as metal contraction caused by temperature swings, though none confirmed the pattern matched typical thermal cycles. Rylan eventually accepted the official explanation, although small inconsistencies stayed with him. He believed the traveler panicked after hearing noises amplified by shifting pipes under the diner. Those noises, mixed with old wiring failures, formed a series of events that overwhelmed a tired mind. Still, he kept the torn notebook page and the scratched mirror in a sealed file drawer assigned to unresolved incidents. Every time he passed the turnout along the highway, he slowed briefly because something about that diner never fully settled. Even after the building reopened under new owners, several travelers reported a strange echo under the floor during quiet hours. Staff claimed the echo came from old ducts that still needed repair. Rylan never challenged those claims, though he remained aware of the gaps in earlier evidence. He chose to believe the desert created its own illusions when mixed with fatigue and isolation. Yet each time he remembered the warm mug that never cooled normally, he felt a chill that followed him long after sunrise erased the shadows inside that forgotten diner. This dispatch recording reveals a final warning. The tape emerged during a major equipment cleanup in early November 2010 when a junior technician named Corbin Weller sorted an old storage closet in a small mountain dispatch station near a quiet highway. He expected dust and broken headsets, yet he found a battered reel marked Night Alert with a smeared date that suggested years of neglect. Corbin planned to toss anything unreadable, but the careful handwriting on the label felt intentional enough to keep him curious. He waited until his shift ended before loading the tape into an aging player in the break room. The audio crackled twice before locking into a clear channel that carried the steady voice of dispatcher Rowan Pike, who had worked overnight duty for years without incident. His calm tone described routine conditions on the Ridge Road with dry pavement and light wind that made the route easy for travelers. A ranger named Tessa Rourke checked in from the overlooked turnout where she monitored late traffic for safety concerns. Her voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone who treated the mountain as familiar ground rather than difficult terrain, even during long, quiet hours. 6 minutes into the recording, Rowan asked about a faint tapping behind her speech that sounded like metal nudged at a slow rhythm under shifting pressure. Tessa paused, then admitted she heard it too, although she believed it came from a loose drainage grate near the turnout that often rattled after dusk. She dismissed the sound as ordinary maintenance trouble while assuring him she would inspect it soon. Rowan accepted her answer, yet the tapping continued with steady timing that broke from typical weather patterns and made him uneasy despite his training. The tape captured a slight tremble in her radio as the tapping grew sharper, as if something heavy pressed against the grate with deliberate force. Rowan told her to stay alert because the pattern felt too precise for random vibration. She agreed while stepping back toward her patrol truck with boots crunching over cold gravel. The microphone picked up her breathing, which turned fast and shallow once the tapping stopped without any fading interval. She whispered that she sensed movement beyond the tree line, though she could not yet identify size or shape. Rowan asked for details, and her answer arrived in a tense, quiet tone that carried controlled fear. She said a tall, narrow figure stood between two pines with a posture that looked too still for any animal she recognized along these routes. She insisted the shape did not sway with the wind and seemed angled toward her position in a watching stance. Rowan instructed her to get inside her vehicle and lock the doors until he contacted the closest ranger for support. She acknowledged him, then moved quickly with clear urgency. Her door slammed on the audio and the engine rumbled through the static as she locked every entry. She reported that the figure now stood behind her truck, though still out of direct light. A slow scrape crept across the microphone like metal dragging on painted steel as something brushed her tailgate. Rowan demanded a clear description once she raised her spotlight toward the rear window. Her breath caught as the beam hit the figure, which shifted instantly toward the forest, with unnatural speed that she described as wrong for any human motion she had seen on duty. The figure vanished among the trees without sound, which unsettled Rowan more than the earlier tapping. He tried to calm her while confirming that backup needed 15 minutes to reach the turnout. The tape held a long, silent stretch where only the hum of her engine filled the channel. Tessa finally said she felt watched again, though she could not see any movement between the trees because the darkness felt too thick for her spotlight. Rowan kept her talking, so she stayed grounded, but her voice remained strained. A deep thud echoed through the microphone, and she claimed the ground seemed to pulse beneath her boots before she entered the vehicle. Rowan asked her to repeat that because he thought he misheard, but she insisted the soil shifted in a slow wave under the gravel. He tried to rationalize the thud as settling rock common in cold mountain regions, though his tone betrayed doubt. She said the pulse traveled in a direction rather than spreading evenly, which made her believe something moved beneath the turnout. The recording grew distorted as she whispered that the figure returned, though now it stood beside a tree much closer to her passenger door. Rowan called her name with sharp urgency while she scrambled for better visibility through the window. A sudden metallic impact rang through the microphone, followed by a short cry that cut off with chilling abruptness. Static flooded the audio, then dissolved into hollow silence, while the engine continued to idle steadily. Rowan repeated her name several times without response, and finally switched channels to call for immediate assistance. Backup reached the turnout with lights sweeping across frost-covered ground. They found her truck idling with the driver door wide open and her radio placed carefully on the seat. No footprints or drag marks circled the vehicle despite soft frost that should have recorded every movement. The official report suggested she chased a possible trespasser into the forest and became disoriented, which local volunteers quietly disputed after helping with extended searches that revealed no trace of her anywhere near the ridge or the lower trails. Corbin listened to the tape twice more before admitting he felt nervous inside the break room, even with fluorescent lights above him. He believed she encountered a trespasser, but could not explain the absence of tracks or the underground pulse she described with steady clarity. He investigated the drainage grate during his next shift, yet found no height or depth that matched the deep thud carried on the recording. The grate showed no damage and no signs of forced pressure that could create rhythmic tapping. He brought the tape to his supervisor, who sealed it inside a locked archive drawer scheduled for regional review. 2 days later, the drawer held no tape and no sign that it had ever been checked out. The supervisor assumed a filing error, yet Corbin found no similar reel anywhere in the station. His only comfort came from a private digital copy he made during the initial playback out of habit rather than suspicion. During late shifts, he sometimes heard faint tapping under the dispatch floor during quiet hours. He dismissed the sound as old pipes adjusting to cold air, though the taps followed the same slow rhythm he remembered from the tape. Each time the tapping stopped sharply, the room filled with tense silence, identical to the moment before her final warning. Corbin avoided mentioning these incidents because he feared they would sound like imagination rather than observation. Months passed before he rewatched the digital copy and realized something new. The final second before the static carried a soft breath from outside the truck rather than inside. The breath sounded deep, steady, and close to the microphone, as if someone leaned near the open door with calm patience. The breath ended with a faint step that barely registered through the static, but held weight that did not match her lighter movements captured earlier. Years later, the digital copy remains the only surviving record of that night because the original tape never resurfaced. Corbin keeps the file on a single encrypted drive that he rarely opens because the final breath unsettles him more than any other part of the recording. He believes the breath matters because it proves someone stood beside her truck before the static claimed the channel, which means her last fear was not imagined but observed. The quiet truth behind that railroad service tunnel. Dispatch logs from a rural county reportedly flagged a strange pattern that focused on an old tunnel near a maintenance siding. Those logs hinted at a series of calls that described footsteps inside the tunnel when no workers were scheduled to be there. Ferran Coyle was a 36-year-old track inspector who handled routine checks along a tired freight corridor that bordered pine scrub and scattered ranch properties. He arrived before sunrise on a cool morning in late 1999 with a simple plan to confirm reported drainage issues near the north entrance of the tunnel. He expected a quick inspection followed by a standard form filed at the small depot office. He parked his truck near the faded signal tower and slung his gear bag over one shoulder, while the sky turned slowly from deep blue to dull gray. He walked toward the tunnel mouth with the usual confidence of someone who had spent years inside tight places and decaying structures. His boots crunched evenly on gravel that clicked against the rust-stained rails. The plan changed after he spotted a narrow streak of mud across a maintenance door set into the concrete wall beside the entrance. He knew that door should have been sealed 2 months earlier after an internal order directed crews to retire a forgotten tool alcove behind it. The instructions were clear on company records that the alcove had become unsafe after repeated washouts and was not to be opened again. Ferran crouched to study the door and saw fresh scuff marks near the bottom that looked like someone had scraped something heavy across the frame. A thin line of water traced down from the latch and darkened the gravel below. He listened for movement and heard a faint tap that sounded like metal striking stone somewhere inside the tunnel where darkness gathered like a heavy curtain. Witness accounts from workers who had used the tunnel in earlier years mentioned odd sounds during night shifts that resembled a slow dragging rhythm. Those older reports were never confirmed by supervisors and were often dismissed as stress-induced hearing fatigue. Ferran had always believed those stories held small grains of truth that deserved respect. He opened his notebook and wrote a quick timestamp, followed by a simple description of the muddy door. He raised a small portable recorder and pressed the warn button to capture ambient noise that pulsed through the tunnel. The tap grew stronger, as if echoing against a deeper chamber. The sound pattern matched older recordings stored in a dusty cabinet at the depot that he had reviewed the previous winter. Ferran unlatched the maintenance door and stepped inside the alcove that smelled strongly of wet soil and neglected machinery. The beam from his flashlight struck rows of rusted tool hooks lining the walls. Several hooks were empty, even though inventory sheets claimed every item had been removed during the official closure. A slim track wrench lay on the ground near the far corner with a layer of clean grit across half its handle that suggested it had been dropped recently. He examined the floor and found a thin trail of dark sludge that continued toward a narrow gap behind a leaning support panel. The panel looked as if someone had shoved it aside with a steady and deliberate force. Ferran moved closer and felt cool air rising through the gap with slow, steady pulses, like weak breaths drifting through broken stone. He radioed the depot office and reported a possible breach in the sealed alcove. The dispatcher asked him to hold position until a second inspector arrived from a yard 20 miles south. Ferran agreed, yet continued recording his surroundings because the tap inside the tunnel had grown into a hollow knocking pattern that sounded too rhythmic to be wind-driven. He pushed the panel aside and revealed a small cavity that workers had once used to route cables during upgrades that took place in the early 1980s. That cavity appeared larger than official diagrams showed and extended into a sloping passage coated with mud and shattered limestone flakes. He knelt to study the passage and saw faint shoe impressions that curved downward as if someone had walked into the dark without hesitation. Archived reports described a missing crew member who vanished near this tunnel during a severe storm in 1978. Search teams found none of his gear, and investigators noted that his last known position matched the location of the old cable cavity. Supervisors later wrote that he had likely slipped into rising runoff waters, then been carried beyond reach. Ferran always wondered why those files lacked detailed maps of the conduit network. He climbed into the passage while the distant knocking faded into a soft, repetitive thud that throbbed like a pulse behind heavy fabric. The air grew colder as he descended, and his flashlight beam caught a rust-colored streak across the left wall that narrowed into thin scratches. The scratches ran parallel for several feet, then split into branching marks that looked frantic and uneven. He recorded the marks and estimated their age based on the flaking debris gathered below them. The dryness of the flakes suggested they had formed many years earlier, yet the upper edges looked freshly chipped, which confused him and made him tighten his grip on the recorder. He walked deeper as the floor leveled and met a small junction space supported by old steel beams that bent slightly inward. He almost stepped on a folded jacket placed neatly near the base of one beam. The fabric was sun-faded and stiff, yet held a faint patch that matched the logo used by track crews in the 70s. Ferran photographed every angle and whispered, "How did it stay dry this long?" even though the recorder picked up the question with a faint crackle. Another passage continued beyond the junction and narrowed into a wedge-shaped corridor that veered under the main tunnel. Ferran followed the path while watching for loose stone that might collapse under his weight. The corridor opened into a circular chamber carved roughly by crews who had once planned to expand drainage culverts, yet abandoned the project due to unstable rock conditions. He swung the flashlight slowly and saw a small pile of objects arranged in a careful ring. The objects included a broken lantern base, a warped set of pliers, and a metal tag that belonged to an older uniform design. None of the pieces looked recent. Yet a single tool lay in the center of the ring with clean edges and bright markings that indicated it had been used within the last week. He reached for the tool and paused when he felt vibrations under his boots that trembled through the chamber in short bursts. He checked his recorder and noted that the microphone captured a low, steady hum originating from the main tunnel. The hum pulsed like machinery, starting and stopping, despite no active equipment scheduled anywhere near this zone. He retreated to the junction and radioed the dispatcher with a brief description of the chamber and collected items. The dispatcher told him that the backup inspector was delayed due to a blocked crossing near the yard, which meant Ferran would need to remain at the site longer than expected. He felt uneasy and decided to exit the passage slowly while documenting each step. As he climbed upward, he heard a faint voice echo from deep below that sounded like a strained attempt to form a short warning. The syllables were unclear, yet carried enough urgency to speed his ascent. He emerged into the alcove and turned toward the main tunnel, where the hum had grown louder at a steady pace. His flashlight shook as he approached the mouth of the tunnel with long, careful strides. A shape moved near the center of the tracks where the darkness thickened. The shape flickered as if caught between the beam of his light and the shadows that clung to the walls. Ferran called out, asking if anyone needed assistance. The shape tilted slightly, then vanished as his beam passed across an empty stretch of rail. He repeated his call with firmer tone and waited for any response. He backed out of the tunnel and reached the open air where the gray sky offered familiar comfort. He steadied his breath and reviewed the footage on his recorder. The display showed faint distortions in the shape of a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel for 2 brief seconds before dissolving into static. The image remained too vague to confirm a person and could not be matched to any known worker silhouette. The second inspector arrived shortly after midday and followed Ferran into the alcove. They documented every detail, then sealed the cavity with reinforced plates ordered through an emergency maintenance request. Company officials later issued a short statement that the old cable routes had collapsed and created misleading impressions of deeper chambers. They ordered that the tunnel section be restricted until further geological checks were completed. Ferran never fully accepted the official explanation because his recorder held the voice fragment that carried a tone of warning rather than pain. Analysts reviewed the audio and concluded that the fragment likely came from echo bounce caused by shifting metal. Yet the cadence and pitch sounded too human and contained subtle dips that suggested controlled breath. Years later, Ferran kept the recorder locked in a metal drawer at his small apartment overlooking service yards. He sometimes played the fragment late at night when freight whistles traveled through the open windows. The voice always repeated the same unclear plea with a slow, trembling rhythm that matched the tapping he had heard on that morning. The quiet truth he often shared with trusted colleagues was simple. He believed that someone trapped deep under the tunnel had used the old cable routes to move toward the alcove, yet never reached the surface. He believed the ring of objects showed an attempt to gather tools for a climb that time eventually stopped. And he believed the final warning on the recording came from someone who wanted future workers to tread carefully in forgotten places where help might never arrive. Ferran understood that not all tunnels hide catastrophic secrets, and not all missing crew stories end with tragedy. Yet he also knew that silence in old service corridors often carries traces of lives that never found closure. When he passed the sealed alcove during later inspections, he paused for a moment of respect and continued down the line, carrying the recorder in his bag with steady, determined steps. The librarian who opened the box no one claimed. The record logs for that small-town library always mentioned the same unclaimed box that sat locked for 17 years. Staff treated it like harmless clutter stored near the basement archives, though late shift workers quietly admitted they avoided it. Those notes rarely convinced anyone until a librarian named Marin Halley decided the box needed proper documentation for disposal. Marin was 34 and worked evening hours, creating updated catalog entries for old regional history books. She planned to finish a long list of tasks since a county inspection required all storage areas cleared before winter storms arrived. Her goal that night involved sorting donation bins and confirming whether any forgotten items needed official reports. She expected a routine shift filled with quiet hallways and the faint hum of old lights. She found the box near a shelf of outdated folios, where dust covered every surface except the lid, which looked recently brushed. The unclaimed tag showed a faded date from 2006, along with a note stating owner unknown. Marin lifted the box and felt a faint vibration like something shifted inside with slow, uneven rhythm. She wrote the detail in her task log and carried the box to her desk, where better lighting waited. The lid held a rusted latch secured by an old padlock that snapped easily when she applied slight pressure. She opened the box and found a stack of envelope-sized photographs wrapped in a strip of linen that felt brittle. The top photograph showed a road cutting through farmland under a dim sky, though something near the horizon appeared blurred. Another photo showed an empty room with a chair positioned oddly close to a cracked window. No person appeared in any of the images. Marin checked the box interior and found a narrow notebook with handwriting that looked cramped as if the writer rushed. The first page read, "Start with the places that feel wrong. Do not wait until the light changes." She paused because the phrasing sounded more like a warning than a note. The following pages contained short entries dated across several weeks, though the ink smeared enough to make some words unreadable. One entry described footsteps outside a rural cabin despite no tracks found in nearby soil. She carried the notebook to the reading room where she photographed each legible page for preservation. As she worked, she noticed faint scratches on the table that formed a shape matching a symbol from one of the notebook margins. The symbol looked like a crooked line intersecting a circle near its base. She rubbed her finger across the scratch and felt grooves deeper than normal surface wear. She wrote another note describing the unexpected match. Marin returned to the box and sorted the photographs into rough chronological order based on light levels and weather shown in the backgrounds. Early photos looked harmless, though later ones showed more unusual details. One captured a shape standing near a derelict barn, though the outline appeared stretched in a way that did not match natural shadows. She leaned closer and noticed the shape pointed toward a distant ridge in the background. She checked the next photo, which showed the same ridge as if the photographer followed the direction. The notebook entry corresponding to that time described a night spent near that ridge while the writer listened to a sound that repeated every few minutes. The entry claimed the sound carried no echo across the valley, which made the writer believe it came from above ground rather than from within the soil. Another entry noted a series of lights drifting near tree lines during early morning hours. The writer described the lights as slow and steady rather than chaotic, which ruled out insects or passing vehicles. As Marin studied the entries, she realized the writer kept returning to the same locations despite earlier fear. The pattern suggested obsession or duty rather than random curiosity. She checked library records, hoping to match the handwriting with any known donor, but found none. She searched through the old sign in ledgers kept before digital systems replaced them. One entry from 2006 listed a visitor named Clive Delmer who requested access to regional surveys. No further record listed his name. She felt uneasy because some notebook entries described a library reading room similar to the one she currently used. One entry said the quiet made every shelf feel closer than before. Another mentioned a faint tapping heard under the floor near the archive hallway. She considered coincidence, but the specificity unsettled her. She walked to the archive hallway and listened carefully. The air stayed silent, though a faint draft carried through vents, which explained earlier noises reported by staff. She returned to her desk and examined the linen strip used to wrap the photographs. The fabric held faint marks resembling ink, though no clear letters formed. When she angled the linen near the lamp, she noticed a thin outline of the same symbol scratched into the reading table. The match confirmed the writer repeated the shape intentionally across multiple objects. She added the detail to her log and considered notifying the county archivist, though she wanted to finish initial review before sending any requests. The next notebook section contained a longer entry describing a night when the writer camped near a dried stream bed after following the drifting lights again. He claimed he heard a voice calling his name from the direction of the barn earlier photographed. The entry read, "The voice was thin at first, then clearer when the wind shifted." The writer searched the area but found only broken planks and disturbed straw. He believed someone hid inside the barn, though soil around the entrance held no fresh prints. Marin found the final entries more fragmented, as if the writer grew increasingly distressed. One described waking near a forest edge without remembering travel from the previous location. Another claimed someone knocked on his vehicle window during twilight, though the area remained empty when he looked. The last entry read, "The box stays safe only if I leave it where the silence feels unnatural." That single sentence made Marin glance around the library with a sudden sense of pressure. She stood and walked slowly toward the large front window where streetlights cast thin patches of gold across the parking lot. Wind moved loose flyers across the pavement while night insects tapped faintly against the glass. Everything outside appeared normal, yet she felt the atmosphere inside shift in subtle ways. She reminded herself that long shifts sometimes created tension unrelated to real danger. She returned to the basement to recheck the shelf where the box sat untouched for so long. She hoped to find additional labels or paperwork explaining how the box arrived. She found a yellowed form tucked behind a folio with incomplete handwriting. The form read delivered during staff transition and placed in interim storage. No signature followed, which made the form unofficial. She photographed the form for documentation and returned upstairs with the sense that someone intentionally left the box to be forgotten. Rain began tapping softly against the roof as Marin compiled her notes into a clear summary for the morning staff. She laid out the photos in order and noticed a new detail in the road image taken under dim sky. The horizon showed a faint streak similar to the blurred figure near the barn, though more distant. She checked the margin of the notebook page corresponding to that photograph. A small version of the same symbol appeared again near the bottom. She recalled earlier accounts from former employees who mentioned strange feelings near the archive hallway, though they never provided evidence. She walked the hallway again and paused near a vent that produced a rhythmic pulse as warm air cycled through. The sound matched the described uneven rhythm of the box vibration. She touched the wall near the vent and felt faint tremors likely caused by old pipes expanding under temperature shifts. She exhaled slowly and allowed the explanation to settle. When she returned to the reading room, she found the linen strip slightly shifted despite no draft strong enough to move it. She assumed static cling caused the shift and moved it back to the center of the table. She placed a paperweight on top to prevent further movement and continued writing her report. The final portion required listing any potential hazards, such as mold or unstable materials. She listed none since every item looked structurally safe. Near the end of her shift, she prepared to reseal the box so maintenance staff could transfer it to a secure archive room. She packed the photos and notebook carefully while noting the symbol appeared at least 12 times across various objects. She planned to recommend a full historical research request to determine whether the symbol appeared in older survey maps. She locked the box with a replacement latch and carried it toward the staircase. When she reached the landing, she paused because the building lights dimmed briefly before returning to normal. The power flicker caused a soft hum from the old overhead fixtures. She walked to the front desk and placed the box beside the logbook. As she wrote a final note, she heard a faint tap from the box interior. She froze and waited for another sound which never came. She reasoned that materials inside shifted due to earlier movement. Before leaving, she placed the box inside the staff vault to ensure limited access until morning review. She closed the vault and checked the latch twice. As she stepped outside, she glanced at the second-floor window, where a faint reflection caught her eye. The reflection appeared like a blurred shape near the glass, though she realized it was her own outline distorted by rain streaks. She walked to her car with steady breath while telling herself the shift simply ran longer than planned. Weeks later, research confirmed the symbol matched older boundary markers used by survey teams during the 1970s. The markers indicated unstable ground or unexplored property lines. That information explained the repeated symbols in the notebook, though it did not clarify the strange entries about voices or drifting lights. Marin accepted the likely explanation that the writer traveled through isolated terrain while exhausted, which amplified fear and confusion. Still, she kept digital copies of the photographs in a private file because certain blurred shapes never matched ordinary shadows. She believed the writer documented natural events filtered through stress and long nights spent alone. Even so, she felt compelled to check the basement shelf once more during later shifts to ensure no new boxes appeared without explanation. Each time she walked the hallway, she listened for unusual tapping, though she rarely heard more than old pipes settling. The box remained sealed in the vault, awaiting formal review, though Marin sensed the writer left it with deliberate purpose. She believed the true value lay in understanding why he feared silence more than any sound he described. Whenever she closed the library late at night, she felt a subtle pressure near the archive hallway that shifted the air in ways hard to describe. She told herself it was only the draft from aging vents, yet she always walked a little faster toward the exit before locking the doors behind her. Why this old tape from a lakeside cabin matters. The old tape surfaced during a renovation project that was supposed to be simple work for a contractor named Leland Hartley in early October 2009. He had been hired to clear debris from a group of aging cabins near a quiet northern lake that most locals avoided after sunset. The job paid well, and Leland planned to finish quickly so he could move on before winter storms reached the region. The cabin sat close to the water where the wind carried a strange low whistle that neighbors claimed never followed a predictable pattern. Leland ignored those comments because he trusted clear tasks more than vague warnings. Cabin 7 stood slightly apart from the others, with warped siding that leaned toward the trees as if the structure had slowly shifted over many years. Leland entered the cabin expecting dust and rodents, but he found an untouched living area with a thin layer of cold air that felt trapped rather than drafty. He swept each room until he reached a locked drawer in an old desk pushed against the far wall. The drawer held a single high-8 tape marked with the words "Final Weekend" printed in shaky letters that looked hurried. Leland disliked mysteries, yet something about the tape felt important because it clearly had not been meant for tourists. He brought the tape home so he could view it on an old player he kept in his garage from earlier work that required digitizing older media. When he loaded the tape, the screen flickered until a stable picture formed showing the interior of Cabin 7 from a low angle that suggested the camera sat on the kitchen counter. A couple appeared on screen, identified only by their chatter as Callum and Brina, both in their late 20s and visiting from an unnamed city. Their recorded timestamp showed late June 1999 during a stretch of unseasonably warm weather that made the lake appealing for weekend trips. The first part of the recording showed normal behavior, including joking comments about burned food and the slow lake breeze that drifted through the open door. Their voices carried confidence that came from long familiarity, and they planned to hike a small ridge near the water the next morning. Nothing in their behavior suggested fear or concern because they believed the cabin offered typical comfort. Yet several minutes into the tape, Brina paused with sudden tension after a faint clicking sound came from the direction of the bedroom hallway. Callum checked the hallway without finding anything unusual, but his uncertain shrug indicated he also heard the noise. The tape continued with small shifts in tone as the couple tried to relax, but their glances toward the hall became more frequent. The clicking sound returned twice with sharper timing, as if something tapped the floor intentionally. The camera angle could not capture the hallway clearly, so viewers could only observe Callum and Brina reacting rather than identifying the source. The couple closed all interior doors before setting up a board game that seemed intended to distract them. They lasted 12 minutes before a heavy thump reached the microphone with unmistakable force that caused several items on the counter to shake. Callum grabbed a flashlight and told Brina to stay where she was, but she followed him despite visible fear because silence after the thump felt worse than confronting the unknown source. The footage grew grainy as the couple walked toward the hallway due to aging tape quality. A sudden burst of white noise filled the screen for 2 seconds before the image returned, revealing the hallway door wide open even though the couple had locked it earlier. Brina whispered for Callum to back away, but he stepped forward until he reached the doorway and aimed the flashlight inside the room. The beam landed on stacked boxes and an overturned chair that looked ordinary at first glance, until one box shifted slightly without any visible pressure. Callum inhaled sharply, and the camera captured his hand, trembling as he reached for the doorknob. The light flickered again, then the image cut to another angle of the cabin, as if the camera had been moved by someone off-screen. This change confused Leland because the couple had not touched the device. The new angle showed the living area empty and the bedroom door closed once again. The couple did not return to the frame. The next section of the tape showed night hours passing in accelerated fashion due to a recording glitch that reduced light and sound to faint smears of motion and static. The cabin windows reflected occasional flashes that looked like headlights, but no engine sounds followed those bursts. At one point, a narrow silhouette crossed in front of a window with a smooth gliding motion that suggested intentional observation. The figure stood still for several seconds with its head tilted toward the camera before fading from view with sudden abruptness rather than walking away. Leland rewound that portion several times, trying to analyze the shape without success. The figure held no clear human outline because its limbs appeared slightly elongated and its shoulders seemed uneven. The image quality prevented definite identification, but the posture carried a sense of quiet confidence as if the figure belonged there. After this sequence, the recording shifted back to real time with the morning sun filling the cabin. The door hung partly open and a single backpack rested near the threshold while the rest of the cabin remained undisturbed. Callum and Brina were not visible and no sound came from outside. Authorities reportedly searched for the couple in 1999 after their car remained parked near the lake for 3 days. Weather records from that week showed stable conditions without storms or strong winds. Neither hiker left messages with family, and no financial activity followed their disappearance. Dispatch logs indicated brief patrol checks near the cabins, but no officer entered Cabin 7 because it appeared unoccupied. Their case eventually faded into local rumor that blamed the lake for hiding things too well. The community accepted those conclusions partly because no concrete evidence suggested foul play. Leland believed the tape provided new insight, so he attempted to digitize it for easier review. During this process, his software unearthed several corrupted fragments that did not appear during the initial viewing. One fragment showed the camera pointed directly at the bedroom door from a much lower angle as if placed on the floor. The door moved slightly inward, then froze before any object crossed the threshold. Another fragment displayed flashing images of the lake surface under moonlight, with ripples moving against the wind direction. The final fragment showed a close view of the interior closet with a faint shift of darkness inside. These fragments disturbed Leland because they implied the presence of someone or something that handled the camera while the couple remained in the cabin. He wondered why the device recorded partial moments instead of continuous footage. He also questioned whether the couple attempted to document the noises or if the unknown figure used the camera for its own reasons. His unease increased when he visited Cabin 7 again the following afternoon, hoping to verify structural issues or evidence of wildlife. The cabin felt warmer than before, and the closet door stood slightly ajar despite his memory of closing everything during cleanup. He found no tape in the drawer and no items in the closet besides old blankets stacked neatly against the wall. The air in the room held a faint metallic scent that faded the moment he stepped back into the living area. Leland noted these details before locking the cabin and leaving the property for good that evening. He delivered the digitized copy of the tape to a small regional archive that sometimes handled unusual historical material, though he did not share every detail. He considered telling law enforcement, but the lack of clear evidence discouraged him. Over the next week, he checked the archive for updates until a technician informed him that the digitized file showed unexplained corruption across every recovered fragment. The technician asked whether the original tape had been stored near strong magnetic interference, but Leland denied this possibility. When he attempted to show the technician the specific silhouette moment, it refused to play the section at all. The tape displayed a black screen where the figure once stood. The technician suggested the tape might be degrading faster than expected due to age. Leland kept a single backup of the original digitization on his home computer, which he reviewed late one night after noticing a soft clicking sound in his hallway. He paused the review and investigated the noise until he reached his living room, where the sound stopped entirely. The incident reminded him too strongly of the cabin recording, so he returned to the computer only to find the backup file missing from his hard drive. He checked every folder until sunrise without locating the footage or any trace of deletion. The missing file convinced him that the cabin experience carried more weight than simple curiosity. He believed someone had returned to retrieve the original tape and possibly acted to remove any digital copy. He considered returning to Cabin 7 one last time, but he avoided the area because the lake now felt like a boundary rather than a destination. Leland continued his renovation work elsewhere for several years while keeping his distance from that property. Today, the cabins remain abandoned and overgrown, following a fire that destroyed most structures 3 years after Leland found the tape. Reports suggested the fire began near Cabin 7, though no official cause appeared in public summaries. Leland never returned to the site because the memory of the couple and the silhouette forced him to accept that certain places hold stories that resist closure. He still remembers the quiet moment when the camera captured the closet door shifting inward without help. That single movement convinced him that the tape mattered because it recorded something patient enough to wait for the right moment and quiet enough to stay unseen until the couple reached the hallway. This forgotten photo wasn't meant for you. Reports about this photo surfaced after a retired volunteer mailed a small envelope to a regional archive during late summer. The image inside showed a dim roadside meadow with a shadowed figure standing near a broken fence. The envelope also held a note claiming the scene connected to an incident that never reached public attention. Lennox Haar was 29 and worked as a field assistant for a small environmental survey group based near a rural valley. He spent most days collecting soil samples or checking wildlife cameras scattered across old service roads. His simple plan that afternoon involved retrieving a damaged camera before an incoming storm reached the ridge. He drove a narrow gravel route often used by hunters who needed quiet access to deeper trails. The air felt still and heavy as clouds pushed over the hills with slow, deliberate motion. He parked near a worn pullout because the last recorded coordinates for the broken camera placed it 200 yards beyond that point. The incident started when he found the camera half buried under fallen branches near a shallow ditch. A cracked lens cover suggested it had been struck by debris during a recent wind event. He removed the memory card and placed the camera in his pack because he planned to review the footage later at their office. Lennox began walking back toward his truck when he noticed a second trail of disturbed leaves leading into a small clearing. The path looked narrow and oddly straight, which conflicted with the random patterns that wind usually created. He followed it slowly since local rangers often mentioned that survey work required careful documentation of unexpected environmental changes. The trail ended at a clearing containing a collapsed metal sign hidden under vines and scattered bark. The faded letters once indicated a temporary rest area built during 1996 for road crews resurfacing the nearby highway. That rest stop had been dismantled after funding cuts left only foundations and broken fencing behind. His first complication appeared when he saw an old disposable camera lying beside the collapsed sign. It rested on a patch of dry grass that showed no prints or debris around it. The casing looked weathered, but the film compartment remained intact, which felt unusual for an item exposed to harsh seasons. He picked it up and lightly shook it, which produced a faint rattle suggesting partial film still inside. He placed it in his pack because their office kept an outdated film reader for educational projects. He planned to examine it later and mark its location in the survey log to maintain proper documentation. The second complication appeared as he prepared to leave the clearing. A soft, cracking sound rose from deeper inside the trees as if someone stepped on brittle branches. Lennox paused because he believed a person might be in distress or possibly hiding from the approaching storm. He called out a quick question asking if anyone needed help. No one responded, though. The air carried a brief shift in temperature that made him draw his jacket tighter across his chest. He started walking again and aimed to reach the truck before rainfall soaked the route and turned the ditch into a deeper channel. The forest remained silent, except for distant rumbling above the ridge. He reached the truck and began loading his equipment when he heard a faint metallic click near the tree line. The sound repeated twice and seemed to match the shutter of an older camera. He scanned the clearing but saw nothing except scattered branches and a few leaning posts that once supported instructional signs. Lennox drove back to the survey office and used their small utility room to review the damaged wildlife camera footage. Most clips showed common movement patterns created by deer and small mammals crossing the route. The final clip captured a person walking in the opposite direction of the expected trail during early dawn 2 days earlier. The person moved with a slow and uneven gait and carried what appeared to be a small rectangular object at chest height. The image clarity made it difficult to confirm if the object was a camera, though the posture suggested careful framing. Lennox paused the footage because the outline of the clearing gate appeared in the far corner of the frame. He retrieved the disposable camera from his pack and handed it to a senior technician named Corbin, who handled older equipment. Corbin used the film reader and recovered 8 frames, showing a sequence taken from almost the same angle as the collapsed sign in the clearing. The final frame captured a figure standing near the broken fence with their face turned slightly away from the lens. The figure appeared in muted light, which suggested early morning or late afternoon conditions. A faint shape near the left edge of the frame resembled a folded jacket lying across the old sign. Corbin noted that the film quality indicated the shots were taken after 2010, even though the rest stop closed long before then. Lennox became uneasy after noticing the figure's posture matched the person seen in the wildlife video. Both showed a lean-forward stance and a slight tilt of the head. The rectangular object held by the person on the wildlife footage could match the disposable camera discovered near the collapsed sign. He contacted a retired ranger named Talwin, who previously assisted the survey group with map corrections. She recalled that a solo traveler went missing near that same ridge during early spring 2011. That traveler reportedly searched for abandoned roadside campsites that once held documented historical markers from older transportation routes. The traveler left behind a short note mentioning interest in forgotten structures and plans to photograph locations before seasonal storms erased remaining markers. The final known lead placed the traveler near an old turnout connected to the same service road used by Lennox. Tolwyn explained that search crews relied on those clues but never found evidence beyond scattered gear. Lennox studied the disposable camera images again and noticed the shadow of an upright post near the figure's left side. The wildlife footage revealed that same post leaning at a matching angle in the clearing. This connection implied the person in the photos stood exactly where Lennox found the camera during his late afternoon survey. The twist emerged when Corbin revealed a final partial strip from the processed film. The strip contained one fragmented image that captured the clearing from a vantage point behind the broken fence. The perspective showed the photographer standing near the metal sign with their back turned toward the viewer. The photographer wore the same jacket seen on the ground in the earlier frame. Lennox returned to the site 2 days later because he wanted to compare the angles with the remaining markers. The ground around the collapsed sign showed faint indentations consistent with footprints older than a week but newer than a full season. Thin grass leaned toward the ditch as if someone had stood in the area while shifting weight repeatedly. He moved toward the broken fence and found a small rusted clasp lodged between two boards. The clasp matched a style used for travel pouches sold widely during early 2000 years. He placed it in a sample bag and took detailed notes to match its position accurately. He also found a torn corner of paper trapped under a rock near the ditch. The paper held part of a handwritten message referencing a plan to document a final viewpoint before leaving the region. The ink showed fading consistent with long exposure, yet the paper itself remained relatively intact. Experts later suggested it drifted under debris layers and resurfaced only when strong winds pushed through the clearing during recent storms. Lennox followed the ditch for 40 yards until he reached a cluster of stones arranged awkwardly in a narrow line. The stones looked intentionally placed because they formed a gentle curve pointing toward a shallow rise behind the trees. He climbed the rise and found a flat patch of ground offering a clear view of the entire clearing. He stood there silently as faint wind pushed shadows across the broken fence. From that point, he could replicate the perspective in the fragmented film strip that showed the photographer from behind. This meant the photo captured someone positioned at the rise while the traveler stood near the sign preparing another shot. The most plausible explanation suggested that the traveler photographed the clearing repeatedly while unaware that someone moved behind them at the rise. That person may have used the wildlife path later identified in the camera footage. The storm that approached during the traveler's final day probably scattered additional traces that might have indicated a struggle or sudden retreat. Local volunteers believe the traveler attempted to return to the main road through the meadow, but became disoriented as rainfall obscured the route. The jacket in the image might have been removed during brief rest or while repositioning equipment. The disposable camera possibly fell during the storm and remained protected under thick vegetation for many years. Lennox provided his findings to regional authorities, who updated the old missing person file with the new evidence. They identified the figure in the wildlife footage as likely matching height estimates from the 2011 case. The possibility of a second person at the scene remained unresolved, though rangers suggested a passing hiker might have crossed paths unintentionally. The forgotten photo carried eerie weight because it revealed the photographer moments before an undocumented event shifted the path of their final hours. The image never showed clear danger, yet implied a presence that remained unaccounted for in any official record. Investigators believed the most reasonable conclusion involved miscommunication and lost orientation rather than malicious intent. Lennox visited the clearing once more during early autumn because the survey group needed updated vegetation samples. He said the place felt calmer, yet still held a quiet sense of unfinished memory. The broken fence leaned further, and the collapsed sign sank deeper into the soil, though the meadow continued growing around them with steady resilience. In the end, the forgotten photo reminded everyone that rural trails often hold small, disconnected moments preserved by chance. A misplaced camera or silent witness can carry fragments of a larger story that fades as seasons shift across old routes. The truth behind the traveler's final steps may never be fully known, though the evidence now fits a clearer pattern that respects both logic and the limits of memory. A night guard who returned after vanishing years ago. In archived reports kept by a regional security contractor, supervisors noted an unusual case involving a night guard who vanished during one shift. Those same archived notes later recorded his unexpected return many years after that first unexplained disappearance. The story centers on Marlon Givens, a 38-year-old security guard working occasional contracts in a sparse industrial district outside a small desert town. He had taken a temporary assignment at a storage yard that kept older medical equipment and assorted surplus materials locked behind tall fences. He expected a quiet night and hoped to finish the shift without trouble. He planned to log routine patrols, drink his thermos coffee, then head home before sunrise. The incident began when he noticed a flicker of light near a row of rusted supply sheds about an hour after midnight. He thought it might be a loose fixture triggered by the wind, although the air felt still inside the yard. He walked toward the sheds with a steady pace while radioing dispatch to confirm no technicians were scheduled to visit overnight. The flicker repeated, and Marlon heard a sharp tapping sound echo through the quiet yard. He paused near the first shed and pressed his hand against the metal door, which felt strangely warm against the cool desert air. He reported hearing faint movement inside, which made no sense because the contents were supposed to be packed and sealed for months. According to later witness summaries, the yard manager arrived early next morning and found Marlon's patrol notes abandoned on a bench near the chain link gate. His radio lay beside the notebook with the transmit button jammed downward. There were no clear footprints leading out of the yard, only one faint trail that ended near the same shed Marlon had investigated hours earlier. Authorities searched the grounds for several days using dogs and volunteers drawn from nearby businesses. Archived dispatch recordings captured Marlon's final transmission. He said the shed door felt unlocked even though he remembered spinning the latch earlier. He said something inside the shed kept tapping on the metal wall as if following his movements from the outside. Investigators later reviewed the door hardware and found no sign of forced entry or tampering. Marlon's family filed missing person reports and continued pressing for updates during the following years. Every lead turned uncertain once investigators checked physical evidence. A traveler claimed he had seen someone resembling Marlon near a border town in 2008, but the description stayed vague. Another tip in 2012 involved security camera footage from a bus station where a man with a similar build boarded a westbound route. The man kept his face turned from the camera, and analysts could not confirm the match. 17 years passed before anything changed. A new manager for the same storage yard took over operations and hired a small crew to clear dust and replace older inventory tags. One crew member, named Tessa Brigham, found a narrow maintenance corridor behind a row of stacked machinery crates. The corridor had once been used for wiring checks, although updated systems had made it unnecessary. The entrance had been partially covered by a sliding panel warped from heat and age. Tessa called the manager because she saw a folded jacket tucked against the back wall. Inside the jacket pocket, she found an employee ID card bearing Marlon's name and an outdated photo. The fabric looked almost pristine, which surprised her because the corridor showed signs of long-term neglect. Dust clung to exposed wires, and small fragments of insulation lay scattered across the floor. The jacket seemed placed recently rather than left untouched for years. The manager contacted local authorities who reviewed historical records from the yard. They measured the space and documented the temperature difference inside the narrow corridor compared with the surrounding building. The air felt noticeably cooler inside the corridor, even though the desert heat pressed heavily against the outer walls. Investigators found no living space or hidden compartment, only a cramped passage that appeared unused since before Marlon vanished. 2 weeks after the jacket discovery, a driver passing the front entrance claimed she saw a figure limping along the outer fence line just after sunset. She described a tall man wearing a faded uniform shirt with an older-style security patch stitched onto the sleeve. She slowed her car and watched the figure stop at the gate, then turned sharply toward the side road before disappearing behind a cluster of abandoned trailers. Deputies searched that area before finding fresh footprints beside a short length of broken fence. The prints matched the approximate boot size listed on Marlin's original employment form. A pair of partial handprints smudged the dusty trailer door, yet the angle suggested someone had steadied themselves carefully instead of forcing the door. 3 nights later, a clerk at a gas station about 2 miles away reported a strange encounter with someone she believed might be Marlin. She said the man stepped inside wearing a sun-bleached jacket and carrying a small spiral notebook. His face appeared drawn and tired, and he avoided eye contact except when asking quietly if the station still hired overnight help. The clerk stepped away briefly to notify her supervisor, then returned to find the man gone. Security video confirmed the visit, but provided only a grainy view of the figure as he exited the building. Investigators pieced together a timeline using those sightings, although several points conflicted with environmental data. A thermal camera mounted on the yard perimeter recorded a single figure approaching the sheds 4 hours before the gas station visit. The stride length matched the figure seen by the driver earlier that week. That meant someone moved between the fenced property and the nearby road multiple times within the same night, yet no patrol officers saw anyone on routine checks. Authorities distributed updated informational sheets to local hospitals and shelters. Staff at a small emergency clinic contacted them 2 days later. A man had walked in during a quiet afternoon, asking to speak privately with whoever handled security matters. He said his name was Marlin Givens and that he wanted to return something he had taken from his old job. He reached inside his jacket and placed a folded patrol log on the counter, then asked if he could sit near the entrance because noise bothered him. Clinic workers described his voice as strained and uneven. He told them he remembered stepping into the shed and hearing someone whisper behind him, even though he saw no one there. He said the light inside the shed turned blindingly white and everything around him felt hollow, like the air had drained out of the room. He insisted he had not run away or abandoned his post. He claimed he simply walked back toward the exit and found the yard empty when he emerged. A responding deputy said Marlin seemed confused about the year, although he recognized the town name and his original employer. His clothing showed little wear despite his long absence. The notebook he carried had several pages filled with odd time entries that did not match any known calendar format. Each entry tracked moments by counting shadow movements or changes in distant sounds rather than standard clock hours. When investigators asked where he had been, Marlin paused for a long moment, then said he had walked along the sheds until the ground changed. He said it felt like he crossed through a place built from repeating patterns of metal and dust. He claimed he followed a path that returned him to the yard entrance where he saw new padlocks on the gate. He appeared genuinely unaware that many years had passed since he first vanished. Medical staff examined him and found no serious injuries. His vital signs remained steady, yet his body temperature ran slightly cooler than expected for someone standing in a warm environment. Specialists reviewed his story and proposed several theories, including psychological shock and memory displacement caused by extreme stress. They suggested he might have suffered an episode that blurred his perception of time. They could not explain why his clothing showed minimal aging or why his ID card looked recently cleaned. Authorities escorted Marlin to a quiet facility for further evaluation. He answered questions politely, but avoided any mention of the narrow corridor where his jacket had been discovered. When shown a photograph of the corridor, he lowered his gaze and said he recognized the texture of the wall, but did not understand how his jacket reached that place. He said he felt overwhelmed by certain mechanical noises in the building and asked if he could wait outside until the interview ended. Investigators continued reviewing logs from the night he vanished. They found a short audio clip recorded by a faulty perimeter microphone that had remained stored on an old server. The clip captured a hollow metallic ringing, followed by a voice resembling Marlin's. He said someone kept calling his name softly from inside the shed, even though he knew he was alone. Analysts could not determine whether the voice belonged to a person or a distorted echo created by shifting metal. Marlin eventually returned to stay with distant relatives in another state after the facility cleared his release. Officials stopped their active investigation and recorded the case as a missing person who reappeared under unusual circumstances. They documented every sighting, every recording, and every artifact, but found no clear explanation for the long gap in Marlin's life. Residents near the storage yard still talk quietly about the sheds. Some say the flickering light has returned many times, although the equipment inside has not changed in years. Others claim they have seen a tall figure walking between the crates long after the yard closes for the night. Each story remains unverified, but the security company moved patrol routes away from the sheds as a precaution. The case leaves more questions than answers. Marlin lives quietly and avoids discussing the event except when officials request brief statements. He says he feels grateful for ordinary routines and tries not to dwell on the missing years. He still believes he only stepped into the shed for a short moment and returned to find the world changed around him. No clue in the case? Check the basement steps. Archived county summaries about a stalled investigation often mention one note written in shaky handwriting by a frustrated detective. The note said, investigators found no lead strong enough to explain a disappearance until someone suggested checking the basement steps. The account follows Rowan Latchford, a 34-year-old property inspector assigned to evaluate older rental homes in a quiet valley town. Rowan spent that week finishing reports for a company that kept tight schedules, and he hoped the final inspection would be quick. The house sat on a narrow road lined with cottonwoods, and he expected nothing unusual inside the small structure beyond routine wear and dusty vents. Trouble began when he entered the house near midday and noticed an open binder on the kitchen counter. The binder belonged to the previous tenant, according to later interviews, and held receipts mixed with scattered pages of personal notes. Rowan reached for the binder and heard a faint scrape from somewhere under the floor. He thought it might be a loose pipe, although the sound repeated with a steady pattern that did not resemble typical settling noises. He walked through the living room and found a trap door leading to a basement lit by a single bulb. He descended halfway before stopping because the air felt colder than expected in a dry climate. According to the official interview he filed that afternoon, Rowan stepped onto the second wooden stair and felt a gentle vibration run through the structure. He called out to check whether anyone stayed below. Investigators later confirmed the basement held only boxes, an old dryer, and a short tool bench. Yet Rowan insisted he heard someone move through the darkness as if sliding an object across concrete. He backed away carefully and climbed to the kitchen, where he took several photos for his report. While doing so, he noticed a narrow gap beside the fridge that revealed part of the basement wall. The gap looked new, almost as if someone had cut into the plaster recently. That evening, Rowan delivered his standard paperwork to the office, and the supervisor added the file to a growing set of documents about the property. 3 people had rented the house during the decade before Rowan visited, and each left after short stays. One renter never picked up her final deposit refund. Records noted she vanished during late summer of 2007 after calling a friend about strange noises under the floor. A local deputy remembered limited details about that older case because the missing renter left few personal items. The deputy said they searched the basement carefully and found nothing suspicious beyond the older wiring and a slight draft behind the tool bench. According to dispatch logs, no further action was taken and the case grew cold within months. After Rowan mentioned the vibration on the second stair, the supervisor contacted county officials to reassess the house. A small team visited the property during a cool morning and measured floor temperatures. They found the steps leading into the basement remained colder than the surrounding air by several degrees. They traced the draft to a narrow channel in the wall, although they struggled to find an accessible entry point. A specialist reviewing older structural plans discovered an unusual mark in the blueprint for the original foundation. The mark indicated a void that did not match the visible basement layout. The team returned to the house and placed a sensor near the second stair. The device recorded faint rhythmic impacts similar to tapping on hollow material. The pattern repeated at irregular intervals and grew louder when weight pressed on the step above. A neighbor living across the road reported that the house had a strange reputation long before Rowan's visit. She claimed she often heard soft metallic knocks coming from its open windows at night. She also recalled seeing a tenant in 2011 leave the house carrying a heavy bag while glancing repeatedly toward the basement door. He drove away before anyone spoke with him again. Investigators reviewed audio clips captured by the sensor. One clip contained a muffled voice that sounded like a whisper rising through the floor. The words stayed unclear, yet the tone suggested someone calling for assistance. They compared the voice with emergency calls from 2007 made by the renter who disappeared. Some vowel shapes matched, although experts could not guarantee a perfect link. Authorities returned to the house for a deeper inspection. They removed the boards covering the second stair and found a thin metal sheet fixed between the wood planks. Someone had cut a small notch along the sheet edge, which connected to the narrow channel inside the wall. A slight draft rose through the notch as if air flowed from a lower space that had not been mapped. They shifted equipment and followed the channel downward with a fiber camera. The footage showed a cramped void between concrete barriers filled with tangled wires, scraps of fabric, and a scattering of small objects. One object looked like a bracelet that matched a description listed in the old missing person report. Investigators enlarged the image and confirmed its distinctive pattern from archived photos provided by the renter's family. Workers pried open a section of the wall and expanded the narrow channel enough for entry. They climbed inside and found a small step cut into the concrete, leading deeper than expected. The air remained chilly even though the day felt warm outside. The step descended into a pocket shaped like an unfinished room. At the center, they discovered a collapsed wooden frame and two crates holding personal items, including a journal. The journal dated back to 1999 and belonged to an earlier tenant who left the property without notice. The entries grew increasingly erratic and described nightly tapping under the stairs. He wrote that the sound followed him through the house as if tracing his footsteps. His final entry stated he planned to investigate the second stair because he felt certain a cavity existed beneath it. Forensic teams examined the cavity thoroughly and found soil marks that suggested someone had crawled through the space multiple times. They also found clothing fibers matching samples from the tenant who vanished in 2007. However, they found no conclusive physical evidence at the deeper end of the cavity. The space narrowed until only loose dirt filled the final few feet. Rowan learned about the discovery from the supervisor, who praised his attention to detail. He struggled to sleep for several nights after hearing how closely the clues linked to the missing cases. He returned to the property only once during the follow-up inspection and avoided stepping on the stairs. He said the air still felt heavier near the second step, even with investigators present. Officials eventually released updated statements explaining that structural faults created a hidden path that may have trapped someone inside the cavity years earlier. They admitted uncertainty about the full timeline because evidence remained fragmented. They documented every item found in the void and closed access permanently to prevent future incidents. Neighbors continue sharing quiet theories about the lingering sounds. Some claim new tenants reported faint taps during late hours even after the cavity was sealed. Others believe the vibrations were caused by shifting soil and older pipes reacting to temperature changes. None of those theories explain the whispered voice caught on the sensor or the matching bracelet found below the steps. Rowan still works as an inspector and avoids discussing the case with coworkers. He says the lesson stayed simple. When a property offers no obvious clue, it helps to check the places overlooked for decades. He adds that he remembers the cold air rising through the notch in the stair and hopes no one else hears movement in that space again. This coastal church basement is a hidden trap. Investigators who reviewed an old coastal safety report often mention one overlooked line about a basement beneath a small church. The report warned that the basement layout did not match any registered plans, which suggested a hidden space that few locals knew existed. The story follows Leda Corvan, a 36-year-old maintenance contractor hired to check storm damage along a quiet shoreline district. She worked for a regional service crew that handled repairs for aging buildings near the harbor, and she arrived expecting a simple survey. Her final task involved inspecting a weathered church built during the early 1920s, and she hoped to finish before the tide winds grew strong. Leda walked through the main hall while noting cracks along the plaster and water stains creeping down the stained glass frames. She found the air noticeably colder near the rear doorway, and she marked it as a possible ventilation issue. She planned to measure the heating ducts, then return to her truck before reporting her findings. Trouble began when she stepped into a narrow corridor that led toward the basement. She heard a faint rhythm rising from below, and the sound resembled someone dragging a thin object across stone. She called out to check whether the pastor remained in the building, yet the hall stayed quiet. She decided to investigate carefully because her contract required full inspection of foundation areas. According to her later written statement, Leda descended the first set of stairs and reached a landing paved with old bricks. She noticed a light fixture that flickered weakly, and each flicker seemed timed with the dragging sound rising through the floor. She tested the bulb and realized the wires had been cut long ago. The faint light came from a source deeper inside the basement. The official building file showed only one basement room used for storage, yet Leda found a second doorway that did not appear in the plans. She pushed it open gently and found another staircase built from uneven stone, and cold air drifted upward in slow pulses. She switched on her small inspection lamp and stepped downward until she reached an arched chamber lined with damp walls. The chamber held several wooden pews stacked against one side, along with a wooden crate that had been pried open recently. Inside the crate, she saw pages from a handwritten ledger bound with twine. The pages described attempts to reinforce the church foundation during 1954 using volunteers rather than licensed workers. The entries grew strange as they continued because they mentioned hearing voices from a deeper level beneath the stone floor. Leda photographed the crate and the ledger pages before noticing a narrow passage cut behind a row of broken pews. The passage sloped downward and ended at another set of steps that curved sharply to the right. The dragging sound echoed through the curve, and each vibration felt stronger than before. Leda radioed her supervisor to report a possible structural hazard, then moved far enough into the passage to gather more details. A retired caretaker who lived nearby later told investigators that the basement once extended toward an older storm drain tunnel. He said past staff members occasionally heard footsteps rising through the stone, but they dismissed the sounds as pressure shifts caused by high tides. He also recalled that one volunteer worker disappeared during the 1950s after entering the basement to repair a collapsed beam. Leda continued recording her inspection, and the audio captured sudden impacts on the walls surrounding the lower steps. She described the impacts as heavy strikes that repeated in slow sequences, then paused without warning. She noticed the stone seemed recently polished in certain areas, even though the rest of the basement carried layers of dust. She marked these polished patches as unusual points for later examination. Officials reviewed Leda's pictures and found concealed hinge marks beneath the dust along the side of the step curve. The marks indicated a hidden panel that once opened into another space, sealed sometime after 1973, when new building permits updated the church blueprint. That sealed space matched no registered design and had no documented purpose in county files. A local volunteer group joined investigators to help remove debris from the passage. They cleared the curve and found an iron gate wedged shut by fallen stones. When they lifted the stones, the dragging sound started again, now louder and more deliberate. The group paused to listen, and the sound seemed to circle the chamber below, as if someone traced the perimeter in measured steps. They forced the gate open with careful pressure. The interior revealed a second chamber shaped like a half dome, with water pooled along its edges. The air felt colder than expected for a coastal underground room. Near the center lay a sunken depression filled with old ropes, stained cloth, and a metal toolbox. The toolbox held wrenches and nails coated with salt from decades of exposure. The dragging sound returned when one volunteer stepped near the depression. It echoed beneath their feet and shifted toward the steps, which startled the group. Leda suggested placing a sensor in the depression to track vibrations. The sensor immediately detected movement in a cavity below the chamber floor. The movement followed a steady rhythm similar to someone pacing in a cramped space. Authorities paused the inspection and brought structural engineers to map the cavity. Using ground imaging tools, they identified a hidden rectangular room directly under the depression. The room measured only a few feet tall and had one narrow exit leading into a smaller vertical shaft. Engineers believed the shaft once connected to a storm drain network abandoned during the early 1960s. While examining the depression, a volunteer found a rusted key partially buried under the ropes. The key fit a small lockbox stored inside the church office. The pastor granted permission to open the box, and inside, investigators found several notes written by the same volunteer who vanished in 1954. The notes described hearing someone calling from below the basement stairs during late evenings. The final note warned that the steps felt strange each time he stood on them, as if a hollow space reacted to his weight. The team returned to the chamber and removed a section of stone near the depression. They uncovered the top of the hidden room beneath, and inside, they found fragments of clothing, bits of rope, and a metal tag bearing the vanished workers' initials. The pieces had settled in one corner, as if collected by shifting soil and falling debris over many decades. They also found scrape marks along the stone that suggested someone once tried to climb upward from the cavity. The marks appeared recent compared to the age of the structure, which raised unsettling questions. Engineers attempted to determine whether storm surges created pressure that caused the dragging sound, but found no clear explanation. The cavity remained too deep to allow tidal water to reach it directly. Leda reviewed her audio again and noticed a faint voice layered beneath the dragging sound. The voice appeared to say her name or something close to it. Experts analyzing the clip said the tone matched an echo created by uneven stone curves, although they admitted the pattern sounded strangely intentional. After sealing the cavity, authorities strengthened the foundation and restricted access to the lower chambers. They installed reinforced doors on the basement to prevent curious visitors from entering unsafe areas. The pastor requested the church remain closed until inspectors certified every remaining section. Locals still speak quietly about the dragging sound that Leda heard because similar noises have been reported during older storms. Some residents believe the sound came from trapped air moving through the corridors. Others think the vanished worker may have reached the cavity through the storm drain shaft and remained lost beneath the church long before it was sealed. Leda continues her inspection work but avoids assignments near the harbor. She says the cold air in that basement felt sharper than anything she has experienced in older buildings. She also remembers the way the dragging sound reacted to her steps, as if something deep under the church recognized her presence. You shouldn't ignore footsteps outside that motel balcony. Archived incident notes from a desert county reportedly described repeated complaints about footsteps circling a roadside motel during quiet hours. Those notes mentioned a pattern that centered on a second-floor unit where guests often requested early checkout without offering clear explanations. Rylan Harte was a 34-year-old night clerk at the long-faded Sun Mesa Lodge that sat beside a lonely highway lined with shifting sand and broken fencing. He covered overnight shifts for extra pay and appreciated the slow pace that usually allowed him to read old magazines behind the counter. He walked into the lobby late one spring evening in 2003, expecting another routine shift marked by distant truck engines and a humming soda machine. The plan changed when a nervous traveler named Marcy Bell asked him to switch her from Unit 5 to a room on the opposite side of the building. She claimed she heard steps outside her balcony that matched the steady weight of a full-grown adult walking back and forth without speaking. Rylan studied her tired face and noticed her hands shaking as she held her room key. He reassigned her quickly and decided to check the balcony area after finishing paperwork. He stepped outside with a flashlight and moved along the narrow walkway that wrapped around the motel like a cracked spine. The desert wind carried the smell of dry sage and rumbled lightly against the loose railing. Unit 5 looked ordinary under the dim security bulb that flickered at irregular intervals. Rylan walked slowly and listened for motion in the dirt lot below, but heard only the sigh of passing wind. He knelt near the balcony rail and found a faint line of scuff marks pressed into the dust gathered between concrete and metal. Those marks matched the tread from a rubber sole that had been dragged across the surface with even force. He leaned closer and saw a second pattern that looked narrower and deeper, as if someone had balanced on the edge with careful steps. He photographed the marks with a small disposable camera kept at the front desk for property damage records. Rylan returned to the office and checked older guest logs stored in a creaking cabinet behind the counter. Several entries from the previous winter included notes from guests who mentioned pacing sounds outside their balcony around 2 in the morning. One entry described a slow scrape that traveled from Unit 7 to Unit 5 in a steady rhythm. Another entry stated that the guest felt watched through the curtains but saw no one after turning on the balcony light. He saved those entries and walked back outside near the top of the hour with the intention of remaining quiet while listening for movement. He stopped near Unit 5 and leaned against the warm wall as the wind dropped into a brief stillness that felt unnatural for that region. A faint crunch echoed from the far end of the walkway where a maintenance closet stood, locked behind a warped wooden door. The footsteps moved toward him with deliberate rhythm that pressed weight evenly onto the concrete. The pattern sounded too controlled to be casual wandering. Rylan raised his flashlight and aimed it down the walkway, but saw nothing except dust circling near the railing. He turned the light off and waited in absolute stillness while his pulse thudded against his ribs. The steps resumed and stopped just before reaching him. He felt pressure in the air as if someone stood inches away waiting for a reaction. He turned the light on with a rapid click and revealed an empty walkway stretching toward the dim glow of the lobby bulbs. He checked the railing and found fresh dust disturbed in a long sweeping shape that curved near the corner of the unit. He hurried back to the office and reviewed security footage recorded on a tape-based system that covered only the parking lot and the stairwell. While scanning the stair footage, he noticed a faint blur shape move across the top, landing at the exact time he had heard the footsteps. The blur passed behind the railing, then vanished before reaching the walkway. He rewound the tape and watched it again with the same result. The blur shape had no defined edges and moved with unnatural precision. Rylan contacted the property owner, who lived several towns away, and reported the activity. The owner dismissed the concerns and claimed dust storms often interfered with the old cameras. Rylan insisted that the footsteps were too clear to be wind, yet the owner asked him to finish the shift and write a simple maintenance report. Rylan hung up, feeling unsettled by the lack of concern. He decided to check the walkway again near the second hour past midnight when the earlier logs suggested the most activity occurred. He moved quietly with the flashlight off and leaned close to the railing of Unit 5. The air turned noticeably cooler, as if a pocket of cold had formed from nowhere. He heard slow breathing behind him that did not match the rhythm of wind moving through narrow spaces. He spun around, ready to confront someone, yet again found nothing except his own trembling shadow. He approached the maintenance closet at the far end of the walkway and tested the doorknob, which remained locked. He pressed his ear to the door and heard a faint, rhythmic scrape like fabric dragging across concrete. He stepped back and saw a slight gap beneath the door where dust had been displaced in a straight line that pointed toward the balcony of Unit 5. That discovery made him retreat toward the safety of open space. The breathing sound returned deeper and more labored than before. It came from the walkway behind him with steady tone that suggested someone exhausted yet determined. Rylan refused to turn around and instead walked forward with controlled steps toward the stairwell. The breathing moved beside him, then stopped suddenly, as if the unseen presence had realized he was leaving the area. He reached the bottom of the stairs and watched dust drift from the walkway above as if lifted by a moving body. He raised the flashlight and saw an indentation form in the dust on the upper corner of the balcony, as though a heel had pressed into it with calm pressure. The dust swirled for a brief moment, then settled in stillness. Rylan returned to the office and locked the door while reviewing the security tape again. A new blur appeared near the walkway at the exact moment he sensed the breathing beside him. That blur held a faint outline resembling a full-height figure with one shoulder slumped forward. The tape distorted slightly, then resumed normal clarity after the shape vanished. He checked old maintenance records and found a short report from 1994 describing an incident where a repairman named Garth Lohman slipped from the upper walkway while attempting to fix the flickering security bulb above Unit 5. The report stated that Garth fractured his spine on the railing below and died at a nearby clinic hours later. No follow-up notes explained whether the walkway had been inspected for structural faults. Rylan studied that report and examined the blurred figure again. The slumped shoulder matched the documented injury that Garth had sustained before collapsing. The maintenance closet held equipment he would have used during nightly repairs. The footsteps mirrored patterns of someone pacing while in pain or seeking stability. The next night, Ryland returned to the walkway with intent to document the steps more clearly. He placed 2 sheets of fine dust collection powder in front of Unit 5 and waited in the shadows. The wind remained calm and the motel fell silent except for a distant truck engine passing along the highway. He remained patient until he heard the slow crunch of weight pressing into gravel near the stairwell. The footsteps advanced with steady tempo. The powder shifted under invisible weight and created 2 clear impressions shaped like worn work boots. The impressions pressed deep into the layer, then faded as if the pressure lifted gently. Ryland photographed them quickly, then felt a cold wave pass through him with numbing force that stopped him from speaking. He whispered a short greeting offering help if someone needed guidance. The walkway fell silent until the railing beside him vibrated slightly like a weak attempt to grip it. He watched the dust swirl near the edge and saw a faint slump in the air that seemed to lean forward before dissipating in a slow-motion drift. The next morning, he reviewed the photos and submitted them with a detailed report to the county safety office. Officials visited the property and inspected the walkway while noting that structural wear along the railing had been neglected for years. They ordered immediate repairs and suggested temporary closure of the upper floor. The owner reluctantly complied after seeing the official citation. Ryland stayed with the motel through the renovation and kept the photographs hidden in a small envelope stored under the counter. He often wondered whether the footsteps belonged to someone trying to warn guests of the unstable balcony rather than harm them. He believed Garth might have paced the walkway, seeking another chance to complete the repair that cost him his life. Years later, the renovated motel reopened with brighter lights and stronger railings. Guests no longer reported late-night footsteps or pacing shadows near Unit 5. Yet Ryland sometimes felt a faint pressure of cold air when passing that section of walkway during his rounds. He always whispered a quiet thank you while checking the railing bolts that glimmered under the new lighting. He never felt threatened again. Instead, he sensed a lingering presence that seemed satisfied with the changes and ready to rest beside the quiet winds of the open desert.